In the UK, for example, our strict libel laws have been used to pursue science writers who make such outrageous claims as AIDS can't be cured with vitamins, or chiropractors won't cure your cancer by holding their hands over you. The Church of Scientology has made a science, really, probably the only science that can be attributed to them, a science of going after their critics using copyright claims. So making copyright claims that are just plausible enough to get anything critical of them removed from websites. Basically, these rules and systems have the side effect of magnifying the advantage of the powerful and the unscrupulous at the expense of the powerless and the honest. The U.S. is, in fact, now expanding its repertoire of tactics in the service of enforcing policy on general-purpose networks. They now claim the right to confiscate .com and .net domains that offend it with little or no due process. And just this month, this resulted in 80,000 websites being seized and in error, and having an erroneous notice being put up by the Department of Homeland Security saying that this website had formerly hosted child pornography, and if you're visiting it, you've been trafficking in child pornography, and they're going to get you. Now, this isn't going to get better, and it's not going to go away. It's, in fact, going to become more of a problem because the contradictions causing this problem are only going to get worse. Take 3D printers. 3D printers establish a whole new set of actors who want to regulate general-purpose computers. That is, so first let me just say briefly what a 3D printer is, because not everyone knows. For those of you who already know, I apologize for covering some tired ground. A 3D printer is a way of having a computer start with a digital file and turn that digital file for a 3D object into a physical object. So most of them used to work by removing stuff from a block of metal or plastic or wood. You'd have a computer-controlled mill that would take away stuff to make a shape. But increasingly, they add stuff. So you have a kind of inkjet printer head, you can imagine, that runs back and forth, side to side, and up and down. And it will lay a layer of small, say, epoxy beads down on the surface, and then fuse them with a laser, and then lift itself up and lay a new layer of epoxy beads down and fuse them with a laser. And it's not just epoxy. 3D printers now print in precious metals. They print in titanium. They print in glass. They print in ceramic. They print in sugar and mashed potatoes. So who'd be upset by that? Well, in Alabama, it's illegal to make or sell or possess a sex toy, right? Well, that's moderately regulatable in today's environment. But what I want to know is what happens when a magistrate in Alabama in some local court decides that someone like Bree Pettis, who's a 3D printer innovator who lives in New York and who's got a website where you can upload any 3D plan for any 3D object and plug it into your printer and make it, is in essence trafficking sex toys into this guy's jurisdiction by making them available over the internet where a 3D printer might output them. But it's not just kind of people who we might object to because they sound like they're silly and backwards. There's lots of legitimate people who might want to stop a 3D object from being instantiated, or things that sit somewhere between legitimate and debatable. There are indigenous people who prohibit the reproduction of certain sacred symbols and artifacts. There's gun regulators who, for reasons that I think most of us would agree are pretty good ones, don't want you to convert your semi-automatic to full auto. And then there's kind of weird cases from very deep-pocketed, noted litigators like Mattel, who might say, well, you know, whatever you want to do with your Barbie is cool with us, but we draw the line at uploading anatomically correct torsos that the heads and legs fit in to the 3D printing website so that any kid can 3D print an anatomically correct or worryingly and anatomically incorrect torso. So for reasons that are good and bad, there are a lot of reasons to worry about the output of 3D printers, especially as they expand the repertoire of materials and resolution at which they print. And right behind 3D printers are a whole new range of so-called printers. It's kind of telling that we haven't yet figured out what to call these things apart from printer, even though they're doing nothing that resembles printing. It's kind of like the horseless carriage moment. We'll probably know what these things are really for when we stop calling them printers, but I'll keep calling them printers for now. So we have already in use in labs and increasingly being commercialized bioprinters that can print organisms and parts of organisms, as well as microscale compounds that include patented pharmaceuticals and controlled hallucinogens, or even superbugs. Now, there isn't a bioscientist in the world who doesn't dream of having a really capable bioprinter in their lab. And once they're cheap and widely available, it will make that kind of bioadventurism or bioinnovation available to a much wider pool of people in the same way that, say, desktop publishing made graphic design available to a much wider pool of people. And on the one hand, we'll get some of the positive effects that we got with desktop publishing, like a whole bunch of people who invented a whole bunch of cool things. On the other hand, we're going to get those negative effects, too, of a whole bunch of people who discovered that the inner designer yearning to breathe free actually should stay inside. Now, that's a lot less worrying when all that emerges is a bad and ill-conceived poster for your band than what emerges is a compound that someone might ingest, or indeed a living organism. But here's the thing. The general-purpose computer is already everywhere. It's in your car, it's in your oven, it's in your thermostat, it's in your phone. Soon enough, it'll be in your clothes, and even under your skin. We're increasingly seeing assistive devices that are combined with general-purpose computers that have the power to be better than the organic capacities that they replace. For example, imagine a hearing aid with a million-hour buffer that can also interface with your home stereo and phone. So these things are going to be not just outside of our bodies, but increasingly inside our bodies. Designing general-purpose computers that sneak around their owners' backs is a terrible idea. We've already seen what happens when you add just a little bit of control to networks and computers. Most recently, we saw Iran and Egypt's secret police mining Facebook to figure out whom to arrest. Virus writers and identity thieves have already figured out that when there's technology that is supposed to prevent copying running on a computer that prevents certain programs from being seen or modified by users, that those are the programs that you want to infect with your viruses because they also can't be seen by the users of the computer. Once we create the facility to lawfully intercept terrorist communications, or to speedily take down copyright infringement, or to interdict pirate software, or to remotely prevent bad radios from running, we build the tools by which tyrants, crooks, snoops, and jerks will spy on and control us, even if for the best of reasons. For example, think of building in the facility to force users to update the security software on their device when we found out that it's been compromised. And imagine what happens if that facility itself becomes compromised and someone who's got malicious intent can force an update to all the devices in the field that users can't control. Building a general-purpose PC that's just a little bit locked down is like finding a woman who's just a little bit pregnant. Once the facility can be used for a legitimate purpose, it can also be used for an illegitimate purpose. Indeed, that's the problem that we started with in the first place. But here's the other thing. There are plenty of bad things that general-purpose computers can do. I don't want my airplane's air traffic control signals being interfered with. I don't want child porn to circulate. I don't want superbugs being printed on desktop printers, on the desktop printers of weird apocalyptic nutcases or even absent-minded sloppy fools. But regulating the general-purpose PC and the general-purpose network won't actually prevent these things from happening. The general-purpose PC and the general-purpose network are commodities, and there will always be unhobbled versions that can be had, which means that only good, honest people will have a hard time laying hands on them, and only the good that they can, and they will therefore be locked out of the good that these devices can produce. At the start of this talk, I talked about why we don't regulate baseball bats, but regulating a general-purpose computer is even more fundamental than regulating a baseball bat. It's like regulating a wheel. We all use them, and though they can do much harm, it would be absurd totalitarianism to turn them into controlled substances. Which brings me to my conclusion. We do need to come up with effective solutions to the real problems of the collapse of prior restraint regulation models before the planes start falling out of the sky and whatnot. The first step to doing this is to stop pretending that we can make the PC just a little bit pregnant. The way that we fix these problems is by coming up with after-the-fact solutions that actually mitigate and reduce harm. So when the FCC proposed that locked computing should be used in connection with software-defined radios, I went to some of the radio engineers I knew and asked them what they thought we should do. And they said, well, I can totally see why this would be a nightmare, because I'm a radio engineer, and it's in my interest not to have radios all be clobbered by people running bad software. But I really don't think trusted computing will work. What could we do? And one solution that was proposed to me by a guy named Andrew Huang, who calls himself Bunny Wang. He wrote a book called Hacking the Xbox. And then he was the guy who hacked the original Xbox. And then He's since gone on to found a very interesting company called Chumby that makes little special-purpose computers that you can sit on your desk. And Bunny said, well, software-defined radios are really interesting in that they're pretty good at figuring out what other software-defined radios around them are doing because, for example, they can tune in different frequencies. And since we're all going to have lots of software-defined radio devices around us in our pockets and our laptops and so on, one of the things that people of goodwill could do was try to find radios that are doing bad things, either doing bad things because someone loaded the wrong code on them by accident, or doing bad things because someone loaded the wrong code on them on purpose, or doing bad things because their shields have been dislodged, or any of the other things that might cause a radio to misbehave. And that information could be used to geographically triangulate on the bad radios, and then that information could be passed on to regulators or even allow you to go knock on your neighbor's door and say, there's something wrong with your Wi-Fi access point. Unlike adding trusted computing to radio devices, this would actually work. It would actually allow us to solve this problem. It would allow regulators and cops to find bad guys. It would allow neighbors to fine-tune each other's equipment. It would actually make the world safer. Another example of a solution that's been proposed by people who know what they're talking about for solving the general purpose computing problem is much closer to home, I think, for a lot of us, or at least more visceral, which is what the German survivors of pedophiles have proposed as a solution to child porn, as Germany considered its own child porn censorship wall. And they said, actually, this won't work. And what we really want to do is, instead of interdicting these websites at the border, we want you to take all those resources and use them to find the people who operate the websites and then find the people who made the videos and arrest them. And we think that right now, keeping this stuff out of the public eye reduces the pressure to arresting people, especially, for example, sex tourists who go abroad to commit crimes that are then show up as videos that we get in Germany. And we think that the important thing about child porn isn't just the watching of it, but the really bad thing about it is the making of it. And that's what we'd like you to emphasize in your strategy for mitigating the harms of child porn. And again, this doesn't solve the whole problem, but the censor wall problem doesn't solve any of it, whereas this one actually might have a measurable effect on the production of child porn and the harm that arises to children in the production of child porn. We need this kind of thinking because A, it will work, and B, without solutions, we end up with this regulatory vacuum that will be filled by people who reflexively add spyware and censorship and lockdown because at least we're doing something. So librarians and archivists and people involved in information science aren't just fighting over copyright. This fight is actually the leading edge of a series of regulatory battles that are going to take us through this century and that have at stake whether or not the infrastructure of the information society is going to have embedded in it control, surveillance technologies that will do nothing to mitigate harm, but will in fact put us all in harm's way. So with that, I'll take your questions, and I'm going to sit down.